Race as the entirety of culture. A tomorrow belongs to me tone crept into the many descriptions of American demographic change. The torch had been passed to a new generation of Americans who had a message to convey to their elders. The message was die. We often talk openly, said CNN's commentator LZ Granderson in 2014, about the different generational views when it comes to same-sex marriage and how we casually say the older generation died off. So does the hatred and perspective die off in our country as well? And it needs to be said the same thing about race. When it comes to certain aspects of talking about people of different races, certain ideas and perspectives, it's time to die off. I'm not saying people need to die off, but those attitudes need to die off. The lines between white racism, white failure, and mere whiteness blurred. White people heading towards minority status and becoming a lower percentage of voting public every cycle, wrote Gary Young of Britain's Guardian. The message necessarily gets cruder, particularly with the presence of a black president. The commentator Farid Zakaria compared America's working-class whites to Russians after Soviet collapse. They were central to America's economy, its society, indeed its very identity, he wrote. They are not anymore. Paraphrasing a Princeton sociologist to the effect that white people were just complaining because they had been spoiled, he then contrasted them unfavorably with poor blacks and immigrants who do not assume this system is set up for them. But why shouldn't the citizens of a republic assume that the system is set up for them? The Gettysburg Address said it was set up for them. White politicians began to convey that they weren't oblivious to being spoken this way. A truculent tone unheard in mainstream political oratory since 1960s crept back in. When the Maine governor, Paul Lepage, tried to explain to a midwinter town hall meeting in Bridgeton who the drug dealers were profiting from the opioid crisis that was killing the region's young people, said, "These are the guys with names like D-Money, Smoothie, Shifty. These are the types of guys that come from Connecticut and New York. They come here, they sell their heroin, and they go back home. Incidentally, half the time they impregnate a young white girl before they leave, which is a real sad thing because then we have another issue that we've got to deal with down the road." LePage's talk was striking, not just for the opinions, but also for the unbullied nonchalance in which he delivered it. It was a defense against the new formality that cried, "Race never be alluded to except in a latent officiosity." At Prudential, we strongly believe that talent comes in every color, gender, origin, religion, sexual orientation, and physical capability imaginable. Ran a typical 21st century oath of allegiance. For this reason, we actively seek out employees, vendors, business associates from a deep and diverse pool. At a time when any corporate human resources department could be hauled into a courtroom for professing any other belief, the sincerity of such pronouncements was open to question. A gift the civil rights promised on blacks was to make everything weary of race disappear. Everyone was invited to emancipate yourselves from mental slavery, as Bob Marley sang at the end of his short life, drawing on a formula the black nationalist Marcus Garvey had used in a speech in Nova Scotia in 1930s. After very few years of self-denial, Americans would be able to speak openly to one another. Somehow, they got instead an America where people kept on their P's and Q's about race and gender as never before. Far from suppressing the Southern obsession with race and blood, civil rights conveyed it to every nook, cranny, of the country. The entire culture, all journalism, all art, all books, was suffused with it. A couple of weeks after pages of remarks about drug dealers, and a short hour's drive away, the host of a tequila party at Bowdoin College handed out miniature sombreros, which Candace activists deem an act of cultural appropriation demeaning to Mexicans. Cultural appropriation, an increasingly defined concept that only recently came into vogue, was certain of racial and ethnic plagiarism, and somehow involved in imperial power's theft and exploitation of a subordinate society's cultural practices. 2 students were placed on probation for the offense, and there was a move to oust members of the student government who had attended the party. Uninvolved undergraduates interviewed by a Washington Post reporter sent to cover the controversy asked the names not be used in the article. Just why cultural appropriation was bad never made clear. It wasn't simply that all people had done with successful cultural styles and products. They were doing it now. In fact, much contemporary culture consisted of reinterpreting, where necessary, bowdlerizing the historical and culture of half a millennia of the Renaissance to the fall of communism to make its achievements more congruent with 21st century ideology of diversity. In 2015, Star Wars laundered the plot of the original 1977 Star Wars film into a more multiracial cast. And in 2016, the 1984 comedy Ghostbusters was remade with all female agents. The BBC announced a more multicultural remake of Kenneth Clark and David Attenborough's classic civilizational series in the late 1960s. The new one was to be called Civilizations. At one point in 2015, the Washington Post called the black in Sendai Ta-Nehisi Coates the country's foremost public intellectual. And it was probably right, since race was getting into the sum total of what the country's intellectual life was about. There were columnists in the Post and New York Times who had the job of sounding off about race morning after morning, not because their readerships had swollen the marginal crackpots for the benefits of the new establishment, but the deputies, assistant secretaries in Cleveland Park, in the District of Columbia, the trust fund hipsters of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. One now got the impression that racism and sexism must be hiding everywhere, rooting them out of the listed zero citizens in a way that resembled the hardline anti-communism in the 1950s, but on a far larger scale. Now, as then, the rarity of actual unmasking was taken as evidence of the adversary's guilt. Unlike communism, which involved an actual organization with a membership list, racism had a flexible definition. Anyone might be accused of it. The social scientist Andrew Hacker cited as evidence the rank-and-file Republicans' racism as their agreement with the statement, if blacks would only try harder, they could just be as well off as whites. But, of course, disagreeing with that statement would have been even stronger evidence of racism. The burden of the proof on those with racial grievances was lighter than air. Fari Chaheda, a Harvard-educated television and radio pundit, wrote in The Guardian in 2015. My grandmother died 12 years ago this week from colon cancer. What some people might call the ripe old age of 82. I know the truth. Due to that lack of adequate medical care, she died too young, and I believe race was a key factor. I only can infer, though, with plenty evidence of black lives are cut short through inadequate health care. Reading Ta-Nehisi Coates launched a new book, Between the World and Me. In many response to it, I am cheered in a grim fashion. The rise of attention to physical and economic violence against Black Americans, part of the physical violence that comes at the hands of the medical establishment. This goes beyond lamenting the human condition or lamenting inequality. Shadia implied that the doctors who treated her grandmother were committed physical violence against her and stated that ambiguously doctors wreak physical violence on black people as a matter of course. Nathan Gassler had foreseen much misunderstandings in the mid-1970s when certain radical civil rights policies makers had assumed any deviation from statistical parity could and should be interpreted as owing to an unconstitutional discrimination. All difference, all inequality was being accountable, but now it was not the need to be difference or inequality. All racism was becoming an official narrative in the newspapers, on television, and on the internet. Those who countered the narrative took it to heart. The overestimation of black people's part in contemporary society was extraordinary. About 12% of the country was black at the turn of the century, and according to the U.S. Census Bureau, but the average American believed that 33% of Americans were black, a Gallup poll found. A sixth of Americans believe it was a majority black country. The closest to the accurate was those who held postgraduate degrees, and they even guessed the black population was double its actual size. Why wouldn't they? Most people don't spend their days bonding up on demographic statistics or counting people by race. If America were only 1/8 black, then the obsession way politicians and journalists spoke about race made no sense. The same was true the way politicians and journalists spoke about gays. In the second decade of the century, Americans on average came to believe that the country was 23 and 25% gay, bisexual, or transgender, about 1 in 4. Again, given the dodginess at which the president and the courts took up the cause of gay marriage and the eagerness in which newspapers and televisions reported on every step of their progress, why wouldn't they believe otherwise? Who would have guessed that gays, bisexuals, and transgender people made up about 3.8% of the population, closer to 125? Americans had a distorted view of social reality. Their language evolved to reflect it.